Hello and welcome back to another edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today on Monday, January 4th. It's also a great pleasure to be joined today by Matt Dunne, who is the founder and executive director of CORI, or Center on Rural Innovation. Many of you will remember that Mr. Dunne is a former candidate for governor. He was also a four-term state representative and a two-term state senator in the Vermont State Legislature. But he's been busy with looking at issues that involve rural America since then. And Matt, it's a real pleasure to have you with us today for this conversation on a very relevant topic. Certainly one that figured a lot in the recently concluded presidential election. But just to get us started, I'm curious, what gave you the idea to start CORI? Was there some sense that you had that rural America was either lagging behind urban and suburban America, or what was the motivation?
Yeah, so if you look at the track of my career, which has been an odd one, a circuitous one, it's really been focused on empowering rural people through progressive economic development. That's what I did when I was in the legislature. I was part of a software company based in Wilder, Vermont. When I went off to head up AmeriCorps Vista, that was a real focus, launching some of the first Bridging the Digital Divide initiatives. The economic development work that I did in the Senate on brownfields and downtowns, and starting the first publicly underwritten seed fund in the state. And then also at Google, where I had the pleasure of being able to work with communities where Google was building data centers to help them diversify their economy in different kinds of ways, with computer science education or making sure there's wireless connections or other kinds of things. And getting to do that from White River Junction, Vermont, which nothing like a proof point of showing that you can work for a large Silicon Valley company from right here in the best state in the universe. So that's always been something that has been intriguing me. But my run for governor in 2016 took me all across Vermont in a way that I hadn't been in, really 6, 7, 8 years. And what I started to see was similar to what I was seeing in other parts of the country, was a huge divide emerging between communities that were successful and prosperous and growing, and ones that really were not. And that, was certainly a subject of my campaign. In fact, I tried to make it central to it. It didn't seem to resonate quite at the level to get elected in the primary. But out of that, I had the chance to have a fellowship at the MIT Media Lab, where I was able to dig into these issues of the rural-urban divide. And what I saw was this unprecedented, really underreported phenomenon, which is now referred to as the rural opportunity gap. And this was something that started with the 2008 recession, when everyone came, crashing down. But the recovery was fundamentally different between urban and rural areas. Urban areas went soaring right back. Rural areas did not. And in fact, as of January of 2020, before the pandemic, a majority of rural counties had not yet reached their pre-recession levels. So there was just, and this was a pronounced difference. And then when you dug into the data, you discovered that there were a few drivers to it. They included automation of traditional rural jobs, globalization, which allowed for lower cost manufacturing to take place anywhere in the world, not just in lower cost rural places. And the third was the decline of entrepreneurship, which had fallen off like a cliff in rural places, even in proportion to population. And those ended up with a very different economic outcome, because globalization and automation actually created a lot of jobs in the United States. The problem is it almost exclusively created them in urban places and eliminated them in rural. And so you saw this chasm grow as these economic pressures continued. And you also saw that most of those jobs were created in firms that were less than 10 years old. So the fact that there wasn't that entrepreneurial activity in rural places further exacerbated it. So that, again, as of the beginning of this year, rural America represented 15% of the total workforce in the country, but only 5% of the digital economy jobs, the kinds of jobs that were largely what grew out of the age of automation. So the creation of the Center on Rural Innovation was to try to address that gap. We created it intentionally as an action tank, to not just be a place that would, dive deeply into numbers and pontificate on them, but to actually go out and help develop models for bridging that divide. We started in Springfield, Vermont, which you came down and visited our efforts with the Black River Innovation Campus. We also did work with data and mapping to be able to help people understand a little better what was going on in the context. And we are now, taking off because apparently in a pandemic, remote work, broadband, and rural are a thing. And since those are critical components to the work that we're doing, we have been able to accelerate during this time with our impact and support in the kind of work that we do.
So what do you see as the starting point then for helping to revive rural America and bring it more on a par with those urban or suburban areas that did recover fairly quickly from the 2008-2009 recession? Is it primarily focused around digital matters, or is there more to it than that?
Well, I mean, there's going to be a lot of things that have to happen, and there are lots of opportunities. I mean, rural places have the chance to be a part of the future of agriculture, advanced manufacturing, and other kinds of renewable energy, which is going to be much easier to deploy in rural places than in urban. The challenge with all of those, though, is that they are also continuing to automate. So the number of people that are necessary to do logging has dropped from, crews of 10 or 12 to one person driving a grabber buncher. The movement in agriculture, even in value-added agriculture, is becoming more and more automated with robotic milking on one side. There's also an inventor in Vermont that has created a robotic cheese flipper. Because when you're aging cheese, you actually have to turn them. And they used to have to hire someone to do a relatively dangerous job of climbing up on these ladders and flipping cheese. Perfect for automation. They now have a robot that can do that. But we all need to recognize that means one fewer job in being able to create, excellent artisan cheese that's coming out of the state of Vermont. So we believe pretty firmly that a critical component is to create digital economy jobs. So coding, front-end developers, folks who are doing data science and visualization work, the areas around cybersecurity, which are increasingly important. But also to create the environment for startups. Because while you can do remote work, and I think people's aperture is opening more towards people doing more remote work in digital economy jobs, you also want to make sure that rural places have the ownership of production in the age of automation. And there are some great examples of companies that have thrived in the digital economy from rural places, even though there's this general view that, it can't happen there, which is really odd. And I had in my formative years the chance to work for a great company called Logic Associates that was based in Wilder, Vermont. We served the commercial printing industry all over the world with business management system. So I sort of felt, at a fundamental level that of course you could do this kind of, globally competitive digital economy and software jobs and startups in rural places. But that really became a contrarian view as the larger cities became more and more focused on venture capital as the clear way to do it. Venture capitalists have always said they like to only invest in deals which are within a 20-minute drive of their offices, and that then became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Fortunately, there are those kinds of innovators that are out in rural places that we can point to as examples. And we even went so far as to set up a seed fund that's a wholly owned subsidiary of the Center on Rural Innovation to bring investment dollars to early stage tech companies in rural places, including in Springfield.
How do you see the pandemic we're currently going through, hopefully closer to the end of it, with the vaccines being distributed now than we are to the beginning of it, impacting rural America? I mean, there's been a lot of talk since last spring about folks leaving cities, moving up to rural areas, being able to work remotely, don't need to be in an office anymore. Is that an opportunity in a way for rural areas to begin to kind of seem more attractive to folks who might not have thought of it as a place to live, maybe a place to go for the weekend for a vacation or to go skiing or something like that, but to live full time would not have been an option for them?
I do believe it's an opportunity, and it's a time limited one, right? I think we have a moment that we need to seize to make sure that people don't see rural places as simply a refuge, right? But actually as a place where you can be innovative, where you can actually be aspirational in your career trajectory, and that there's a community of people to be able to engage around that. And that's why we're so focused on creating place-based innovation hubs. Because density does matter when you're doing digital economy job development. You certainly need the tech training, right, to make sure that people who are in that area are able to get the skills to work in this area. You need to facilitate remote work and help employers get used to the idea of employing people and figuring out best practices to do that. You need to do the accelerators and incubators and mentor networks for startups. But you also need to make sure that you're creating the culture and the places and spaces to be able to allow for density and inclusive density. And it's harder to do in a rural place for obvious reasons, but it can be done. And if you look at what, in a larger area like in Burlington, what VSET's been able to do, or even downtown White River Junction has been able to create that live, work, engage type of a setup, even in a smaller community, that can allow for those kinds of virtuous collisions to take place, for people to feel like they have a community to engage with and share ideas, and particularly with people of all walks of life. And diversity is actually a really important piece to it. And it's something that we should be thinking about a lot as Vermonters, because creatives who are working in aspirational ways like to be surrounded by different perspectives, and you need to make sure that you're being inclusive both as communities as well as in the way that you're doing digital economy job creation to make sure that you're capturing that full potential.
Turning to the education front, one of the things that struck me as I've done some reading around the subject is what seems to be happening is that a lot of teenagers from rural areas who go on to college tend not to return back to their rural hometowns, and that luring those folks back, people with college degrees and advanced education, would be important to helping boost the rural economies that we've been talking about. Is there a pathway you're seeing to how we can make that happen, or to have more kids from rural areas go to colleges, perhaps even sort of local colleges like Community College of Vermont or some of our local state colleges, and have them stay in Vermont or a rural area elsewhere in the country to help reinvigorate some of the rural economies that have lagged behind?
Right. Or figuring out ways for people who do go to Vermont colleges to feel like they've got a home here. And that's a lot of the work that's going on with the VSET arm that's in Middlebury, trying to figure out ways for Middlebury students and even faculty to be able to have a place to launch enterprises. We're starting to do some work in Randolph to try to make the same kind of connections to the students who are going to Vermont Technical College, to be able to find a place while they're going to school there locally where they can start to get involved in commercialization and other kinds of things. But the study that really stands out to me is one that the Federal Reserve Bank did a little over a year ago, I believe, which showed that rural college graduates with debt were much more likely to move to urban places than rural college graduates without debt. So that study told me two things. One is the whole notion that all young people want to get out of rural America is false. Because in fact, those that had the most agency were actually more likely to stay, right? If they didn't have debt, they were wanting to stay and actually forge their own future in a rural community. The other was that the existential threat of a mountain of student debt prompts people to follow the narrative that the only place that you can have a high-paying job is in an urban place, when in fact that isn't necessarily the case, especially when you net out the incredibly high cost of housing and other kinds of things. So what Allison Clarkson, who's the state senator from Windsor County, actually introduced a bill last session, which I think she's going to reintroduce, which allows for an individual who's a college graduate and purchases a home, a first home in a non-metro opportunity zone in Vermont, to get $20,000 reduced off of their student debt over 2 years. And if you look at some of the incentives that larger corporations are using right now in the studies around them, they're also finding that the elimination of student debt is actually much more powerful than the equivalent of just a signing bonus, because it's such a factor on people who are now, going well into their 40s with huge amounts of student debt and not feeling like they can get out from under it. It also affects all kinds of other things like your ability to buy a home and other kinds of credit rating pieces. So I think creative legislation like that could be a very powerful tool for Vermont to seize this moment, to be able to tell people who are either Vermonters who stayed here for college or went away for college that they could come back and start their lives here. It also focuses on communities that are, economically distressed, and so are looking for people to come with an infusion of dollars to be able to, take on the homes that may have been neglected, and frankly, where there's still affordable homes to be purchased. And then also to be able to give them the gift over a couple of years of committing to stay, of not having that student debt hanging over their head.
How do you see the coming, well, it's been an issue for a while, but I have a sense that it may be an even larger topic of conversation in the near future, the whole notion of climate change and the green revolution playing out. I mean, in theory, this is a big job opportunity, I think, for a lot of folks to get into industries like solar or energy production of one sort or another in a way that's friendly to the climate. Do you think the green revolution, as it's often referred to, is a chance for rural areas to kind of make up some of this lost ground, or is it unclear at this point?
No, I think it absolutely is. But what I would make sure that people who are interested in unleashing this potential of addressing the biggest challenge facing our globe, to make sure that it's not just the manufacturing and placement of those kinds of green infrastructure, whether it's solar or wind or other kinds of things, but is also around the innovation around that work. And because it should be both. Solar and wind creates incredible numbers of construction jobs and a few ongoing jobs of maintenance and keeping an eye on it and that kind of thing, but much, much smaller. And so you want to make sure that not only is that implementation and construction a part of a rural economy rebound, but also the innovation and the R&D around it, because the potential to do that in rural America should be just as good as in our big cities. And if we can have both of those, then we end up winning for both the short term and the long term.
I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you a question about broadband, since that seems to be one of the topics that always comes up in conversations about rural America. I guess there are just some parts of not only Vermont but rural areas across the country where it's just simply hasn't been profitable, I guess, for cable companies or internet providers to run cable or run fiber to homes in the last mile of up the dirt road or whatever. And the parallel with the rural electrification program of the 1930s is often invoked as something that we're now kind of at a similar point with digital and broadband, that so much of the economy of the future will hinge around that, and we've certainly seen that in spades in the last 9 months or so with the pandemic. But how do we get to a better situation with broadband in rural areas as quickly as possible? Is it short-term things like Wi-Fi hotspots that we need to start with, or should we be thinking longer term, with fiber to the home and really robust solutions that are future-proof, as I believe the term goes?
So, as you point out, this is not a new story, right? Electric utilities did not bring electricity to rural places when it was purely based on shareholder value. And broadband is too important to be able to say that we're only going to do it where it's the most profitable. And you're going to see the same with cellular service. So 5G, which is a big talking point for lots of folks in the telecom space and in policy circles, it's still very clear that most of the 5G deployments going to take place in urban areas, because for the infrastructure, you're able to hit many, many more customers. So we have to make sure that we're looking at public-private partnerships to be able to bridge, to make sure that we've got universal broadband, which is the electricity of our time, using similar mechanisms to what they used in the time of rural electrification. Whether that's direct investment from the federal government that did 50-year loans to be able to put up the poles to be able to deliver broadband, or it's public-private partnerships like municipal and cooperative electric companies. The same thing is happening in rural places now, and Vermont is actually leading the way in many ways. So the creation of communication union districts and the actual formalization of it in statute and investment in those entities to create quasi-governmental organizations that can bond for low-cost dollars and that can actually set up their own ISP or contract out to an entity to run an ISP where there's publicly owned infrastructure is really powerful, and I think is the likely path forward for the long term kind of future-proof fiber to the home. There are going to be some immediate needs, though, and we were actually involved in developing the emergency COVID broadband plan for the state of Vermont, which was really focused on the here and now, because we have thousands and thousands of Vermonters who, either because they don't have the infrastructure or they can't afford the service even if they have the infrastructure, are cut off. And that's true for students who are trying to do remote schooling. It's true for people who are trying to telecommute to work, or even people trying to take advantage of telehealth options. When you don't have the connectivity, you're going to struggle to be able to make that connection. So we recommended, if there was the interest from the legislature to try to address these short-term fixes, a number of things that could be done that would not interrupt or create problems for the eventual deployment of fiber to the home, 100 megabit down over 100 megabit up kinds of service, doing things like mobile hotspots with boosters, some line extensions where there are pockets in the middle of served areas of like 10 or 12 households that just got left out, just getting them the connection, while also continuing to invest in the communication union districts and their efforts to be able to build fiber to the home.
In the few minutes we have left here, I just wanted to ask you one other question. I think a lot of people hear the term rural America and it summons up this vision of farms and small towns and whatnot. But I guess the reality really is that rural America is a much more non-homogeneous sort of place. There are some areas that are economically doing quite well. I mean, apparently areas that are sort of more recreation oriented or whatever have those possibilities. But I just wondered if you wanted to talk a bit about the variety of rural America, or if you think that that's indeed the case, or are we looking at kind of this homogenous kind of entity where if you're not living in a city or a suburb, you're kind of you could be anywhere. If you're in Vermont or Tennessee or Montana, it's all the same thing.
Sure. We have a saying at Corey, which is when you've seen one rural community, you've seen one rural community. Because they are so different. They have such different personalities. You can see that across Vermont. Anyone who's a member of the 251 Club, knows that the variations between, Virgins and Canaan or Guilford, who now apparently have Vikings. But anyway, there's all of these incredible uniquenesses, which I think is what makes them very special. But it's also true in terms of demographics as well as economics. A number of our communities in our networks, we're now working with 18 communities across 17 states and all 4 time zones. A group of them are majority minority, right? That have over 50% Latinx communities or over 50% Black. And so the vision that people might have of rural America being, white and farms and in the middle of, an empty field or landscape is just not the case. Some of the most extraordinary small downtowns are in rural places. Some of the most diverse places in the country are in rural America. What's interesting, though, is that the economic trajectory of rural America has been fairly aligned. There have been some exceptions, but even in the places that are strong resort communities, you don't necessarily see robust economies growing there. You see incredibly divided economies.
So much more we could talk about, Matt, but we'll have to leave it for another time, and I'm sure that will happen as we follow this evolution along. It's certainly a fascinating story and a really important one as well. That we kind of begin to see. I'm not sure if division is the right word or not. It's certainly an overused word, but that's the difference between the economics and social and cultural issues of urban and rural America begin to coalesce a little bit more. But anyway, thank you so much for your time today, Matt. I really appreciate it, and good luck to you and the Center on Rural Innovation going forward in a new year, which hopefully will be a little bit more interesting and better than the one we just, I'm sure, interesting may be the wrong word.
Right.
Last year was pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe too interesting. Anyway, thanks again, and best for the new year, and we'll be in touch.
Sounds great. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.